Good evening. Tonight's children's ministry topic is about discipline and about discipline opportunities. A lot of times you hear people talk about discipline issues or discipline situations or discipline problems. And what I want you to see tonight is when you have issues with kids coming to your church and they have discipline behavior problems, that you can see those as opportunities. And there are incredible opportunities for you there to not only engage the kids, but their parents as well. And so we're going to jump right in. First of all, let me tell you a story. A little while back, several years ago, I was at a conference in, I think it was Atlanta, and it was a children's ministry conference, and I was sitting among all these children's ministers and listening to, it was kind of a roundtable discussion, and a lady spoke up at one point, and she said, we have a lot of discipline problems, and the reason we're having these problems is because we're reaching a bunch of students and kids from the community, and a lot of them don't have discipline at home, and they don't have discipline even in the school system. And she said, we're having just a bunch of problems. And so as the conversation continued, somebody asked her, well, what do you do when somebody misbehaves? Because she mentioned that the kids they're out of control, just kind of running around, not paying attention, that they were, sometimes they would cuss, and what do you do? And her response was that they had had several meetings and had finally come to the conclusion that they were not going to discipline any of them. And the reason was, she said, we want kids, when they come to our church, we want them to experience and understand the love of God. And boy, I couldn't help myself. And because I was gritting my teeth already, and I finally spoke up and I said, if kids are coming to your church and they are out of control and there are no limits and no bounds, and you're not correcting that behavior, you're doing anything but showing them the love of God. Because the love of God includes discipline and correction. And so that's a natural part of the Christian life. And so for us to show that love to our kids, the children in our ministry, involves discipline as well. And so let's jump right into just a little bit of background and a story that I want to share with you. I think that'll lay a foundation. When I was a pastor, I pastored a small church in an inner city area. It was the prostitution capital of the city that we were in. And in our neighborhood, just about any crime that you can imagine happened every month. And every month I would get different reports, and the reports would tell me the crimes that happened in our area. And that every month I would see that every kind of crime would be happening inside our community. And so knowing that, our kids were involved in all sorts of things, and our neighborhood had a lot of gang violence, and there was a lot of a lot of our kids, a lot of poverty, and a lot of our kids, they would go around barefoot in the neighborhood because they had one pair of good shoes. And that one pair of good shoes was supposed to last them all year long. And so they would wear those shoes to school, but around the neighborhood, they just ran around barefoot. And that always concerned me because with our kids running around barefoot in the neighborhood, as I walked around and went door to door, I would find, of course, there were bottles and broken glass everywhere, and I would find syringes, and I would find, even in our parking lot, our church parking lot, people would throw their used condoms. On more than one occasion, somebody shot one of our windows with a BB gun or pellet gun. It was that kind of community. And so when we started reaching kids, we had kids with all sorts of, let's just call it issues. One of my second graders had a police record for assault on more than one occasion with a baseball bat. Another one of my second graders, a year later, he actually set his house on fire, and they moved because he burned their house down. A lot of issues happening there, and not just with the kids. We're talking with everybody in their family, adults and youth. So when you start reaching people out of the world, you have to naturally expect that along with that is going to come some of the issues. You're going to have kids come to your church and they've never been in church before. They don't know what appropriate behavior is sometimes unless they're told what it is. Well, on one occasion, a young man came to our church And he was, probably 9 years old. His name was Mikey. And Mikey, it was the first time he had ever been at church. And he came to Vacation Bible School. And there at Vacation Bible School, he had fun during the opening rally. And then right after, they went out to their snack time, right after the opening. And then they had class time. And so I went to eat snacks with him. And I sat down across from Mikey and his brother, because I'd met his brother before, but I was just getting to know Mikey. And so we're talking and we're joking around. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, Mikey turns and he starts punching his brother. Just starts hitting his brother just right in the face. And so I stepped up real quick and I stuck out my hand to get it between Mikey and his brother. And when that happened, Mikey turned and he looked at me and he looked scared because he didn't know what was going to happen. And so he turned and he started running out of our church fellowship hall as fast as he could. Now, he was short and he was kind of hefty. And so he's chugging along. And so I get up and I start going after him. And he rounded a corner in our church. And when I got to that corner, I realized Mikey was picking up some speed. And so he was heading down our corridor really fast. And so I had, as pastor, I was moving really fast. People and teachers are getting out of my way. And because I knew if I didn't catch Mikey, when he got to the door of our worship center, I knew if he got in that door, there were several exits, and I was afraid he was just going to be gone. And so I caught him right as we got to that door. And as soon as I got there, he was pulling the door open. I put my hand on the door, and immediately I dropped down to my knees because I wanted to get eye to eye with him. So I dropped down to my knees, we're eye to eye, and I looked at him and I said, Mikey, I said very quietly, very calmly, I said, Mikey, I want you to tell me why you were hitting your brother. And he said, well, my brother, he took my cookie and he dropped it in my drink. Now, I was sitting right there. That happened. I didn't see any part of that. Now, it did happen, but I didn't see it. And he was just frustrated and red in the face. And I told him, I said, Mikey, I said, I want you to know that I love you and I care about you. But we have rules here. And one of our rules is that you cannot go around hitting your brother in the face. And he said, he put his hands down and he kind of clenched his teeth and he said, I want to go home. And it just broke my heart. That this is his first time at church. And what's happened? His brother took his cookie and then he hit his brother in the face and now he's wanting to go home. And so I said, Mikey, I said, I'd love for you to stay. But if you want to go home, I will walk you home. Because I knew where he lived. It was just about 2 blocks from our church. I said, I will walk you home. He said, I want to go home. I said, okay. And so we walked home and we talked a little bit as we walked. And then when we got to his house, I knocked on the door and the mom came to the door and I just explained to her what had happened. And then I got down on my knees in front of Mikey again. And I told him, I said, Mikey, I said, I want you to know you are welcome to come back. In fact, we would love to have you come back. And we care about you. I care about you. And I would love to see you there tomorrow. But tomorrow, we're going to have the same rules that we have today. The rules aren't going to change. And so the next day, I didn't know if Mike would be there or not. I honestly, I didn't expect him to come. But he was one of the first kids through the door. And he came in, he was so excited. And when I saw him, I went up to him and I gave him a high five. And we didn't talk about what had happened the day before. The day before had been very clear. We have rules, and he knew that, and so we didn't need to rehash that. Gave him a high five. So glad you're here, Mikey. And so opening rally, he did great. Snack time, he made it through snack time this time. But as soon as he went to class, they were not in class more than 5 minutes. And there was a teacher in there, and there was a youth leader. The youth leader came to get me, and when she got me, she came in just kind of flustered, and she said, you've got to come. Mikey has lost control. And so I went down, and to this day, I've never seen this scene in any church before. When I got to Mikey's classroom, Mikey was in the classroom, but all the kids and all the leaders were outside the classroom. He had literally cleared the room. He started throwing a fit, having a tantrum. He threw a chair. And at that point, for safety, they got the kids out. And Mikey was in there by himself. And I peeked in the window, and he was standing there just mad, red in the face, just angry. And so I opened the door, and when I stepped in very quickly, I got down eye level with him again. And I said, Mikey, I said, I want you to tell me what's happening. And Mikey just made this angry face, just red. And he said, I hate everyone. He said, I hate my teacher, I hate my brother, I hate my parents. And he had had his head down. At this point, he raised his face and he looked me right in the eyes, and tears started coming down his face. And he said, I hate everybody but you. Now, in the moment, I didn't have a chance really to absorb what that meant. But looking back, I understood it so much more clearly. You see, Mikey lived in a situation where there was no structure. There were no rules. There was no consistency. And so the fact that somebody could look at him and say, I love you. I love you. I care about you. But we have rules. And the rules are, and these rules aren't going to move. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is even kids that have behavior issues, there is a sense of security when there are rules that are established and rules that are clear. Because it's very important that kids don't just understand there are rules, but they understand what those rules are. And it's also very important that when a kid does something wrong, that he clearly understands what he did was wrong and what it was, and then why that's wrong. And so with Mikey, in hindsight, what I learned through that was a lot of times when I see these churches or individuals and they don't want to lay down a structure because they're afraid that these kids are going to walk away and they're not going to experience love. What they're missing is there is a love that kids are hungry for. And this love is the kind of love that is firm but loving, consistent, that draws those lines, but they also know that if you say it, you mean it. In other words, there's not a bunch of empty threats. There's not a lot of lines drawn in the sand, and once they step over it, you just keep pushing it back. That is firm and consistent, because that's what so many of our kids are missing in their daily lives. Even at school, certain consistencies that for some of them aren't there. And that was Mikey. That was why he had such a deep affection for me, was because I was meeting a need in his life that nobody else was. And so we're going to springboard from here forward just a little bit. I don't want you to look at discipline issues as problems. I want you to look at them as an opportunity to one-on-one engage a child in what's going on with them, and then to go further than that, to engage their family. Because a lot of times if they're having discipline issues at church, they're having those same discipline issues at home and at school. I can't tell you how many times that I have talked with a parent after an issue, and that mom or dad, tears will come to their eyes, or I've had many moms begin to cry, and they begin to say, what he's doing here, it's the same thing that's happening at home, the same thing we're having trouble with at school. And so there are ways that you can come alongside and to help and support that family. And many times those are families that are not even coming to your church, but you get to become a part of what's happening with them, come alongside them, and to help them with what's going on. And so I want to walk you through a discipline process. And this is a process that kind of developed for us over a number of years. I served in small churches. I pastored a very small church. After my frustration with pastoring was that my adults changed so slow. And so God promoted me to youth ministry. And in youth ministry, youth, they change quickly, but half of what I did as a youth minister, half of what I did was repair work. And so I found myself all the time as a youth minister thinking, I wonder what would have happened differently if this student would have had a solid foundation by the time they were 13 years old. Instead of waiting till they're 13, and now they're learning the basics of what it means to know Christ, to know Scripture, and to follow. And so God promoted me, again, He promoted me to children's ministry. And in children's ministry, God taught me so much about the uniqueness of each individual and what it means to meet their needs where they are. And so with children, in small churches and in large churches, this is a process that we developed over a number of years. And so the last church that I was a children's pastor at, this was our process. If a child was in a classroom and that child was misbehaving, breaking the rules, the teacher would pull them aside. Now, it's best to have this conversation away from the eyes of everyone in the class. In other words, you always want more than one teacher in there, and that's not just for discipline reasons, that's for safety reasons too. And so a teacher pulls them aside outside of the classroom, has a conversation that basically goes like this. Let's say she's talking to Johnny, and let's say Johnny has been playing with the blinds, messing with it, and they've told him, hey, stop, that's distracting, and he hasn't done it. And so they pull Johnny aside, one of the leaders does, pulls him aside, gets down on his level, eye to eye, and says, Johnny, I care about you, and I want you to be in class. And in class, that's where we're going to learn, and that's where we're going to have fun. But Johnny, we have rules, and we've told you not to mess with the blinds because that is distracting the other students. And they can't pay attention if you're doing that. Now, do you see where the teacher is being clear about what he's doing and about why? Because it's one thing to say, oh, don't do that, don't do that. Something else to say, don't do that. And here's the reason why. And so the teacher is on his level. The teacher is laying down, explaining why. Now, at this point, the leader would say, I want you to come back in. This is your only warning. If you do anything else that distracts anything else, then immediately we're going to take you to, in our situation, we had a group of trained individuals in our office. Or in your church, it may be one individual. But if you continue to do this, we're going to take you to. Now, notice they're laying down the rule. They're drawing a line in the sand. They're saying you can't do this anymore. And if you do it one more time, here's the consequence that's going to happen. And so let's say Johnny goes back in. He's great for a while. And then he reaches over because he wants to test the waters. And a lot of kids coming straight out of the world, when they're new to coming to church, that's what they're going to do. They're going to want to test those waters. And so especially if they're used to inconsistency, they're going to want to find out how far are you really consistent? Are you really going to mean what you say? Are you going to follow through? Now, it is a huge, huge deal if you do not follow through with what you say. And I want to paint this in a bigger picture. If a teacher stands in front of their children, they're teaching their kids, and they say, if you do this one more time, such and such, and then the kid does it and they don't follow through, what they have taught that child and everybody else in the class that saw this happen, what they've taught them is when I say something, you can't always trust what I say because the follow through isn't there. And so you take that from a discipline issue and you take that and put it in context of the idea that this person is teaching God's truth. Well, if I can't trust you on that, if you say one thing but you don't follow through, how can I trust you in these other areas? Do you see how it cuts out the legs of what you're trying to accomplish with your kids in your class? And so as a teacher in this Sunday school setting or small group setting, whatever it is, you want to have that consistency always. Now, when you first start leading, where you want to head off problems is at the very beginning. If you let problems grow, if you turn a blind eye to them, if you just ignore them, they're not going to go away. They're going to amplify and grow. And so at the very beginning, when you first have a class, you want to engage those situations in the correct way. Now, our process, like I said, so a child's doing something wrong, they're misbehaving in some way, and so a teacher pulls them aside, explains why they're doing, what they're doing is wrong, and why it's wrong. And then that teacher has the conversation. I care about you, I want you in class, but we have rules, and to be in this class, you have to follow these rules. And then the child gets a chance to go back in. That's their warning, but that's their only warning. And so if the second time they push the line, they cross the line again, this time the teacher doesn't have that conversation. Simply pulls the student aside and says, we had a conversation earlier about some things that you were doing that were distracting, and I told you you had one warning, and you've done it again, and so now this child is going to understand there are consequences for the things they do. And so this child, in our case, they were brought to me. And then I would have this conversation with the child. I'd get down on his level, eye to eye, and I would say, Johnny, your teachers told me what you were doing in class and told me that they pulled you aside and they had a conversation. And Johnny, I want you to know that I love you and I care about you and I want you to be in class because that's where you're going to learn and that's where you're going to have fun. But you've been brought to me, so you have one final option, and it's this. You can either go back in and you can do everything your leaders say, or you're going to spend the rest of the time sitting here where I am, and you're not going to have snacks, and you're not going to do anything. You're going to sit there, and when your parents come to pick you up, we're going to have a conversation about what you did today. And now, most children look and immediately, and this is a defining moment, at this point, you're going to get some great insight into what is driving and motivating this child. Most children, they say, I will go back in. They have that look on their face, I will go back in and obey. And my experience has been 80% of them go back in and they are great the rest of the time. Now, 20%, now I tell them, If you go back in, anything else, you come back out. There are no more options. There are no more warnings. You will sit in that chair. When your parents get here, we're going to have a conversation about what happened today and what needs to happen in the future. And now, I've had people ask me, well, Colby, you're a fun guy. Don't kids like being with you? Don't they like sitting in that chair while you do what you do? And the answer is no. Simply because we eliminate all fun from that chair. I mean, they sit there, and me, for instance, there was a little kid during Vacation Bible School. We were on a mission trip, and our teachers on this mission trip, they had been trained with this discipline process, and so a little boy named Timothy was brought to me, and he's sitting in the chair, and so I did what I typically would do. I told the leader, I said, bring me two things of cookies and bring me 2 cups, 2 drinks. And so they brought it in, put it on the desk. You know, I'm just sitting in there. I think I was preparing for the closing rally, and he's just sitting over there quietly. And after about 3 minutes, he said, is one of those for me? And I looked up, and very quickly I said, no. I said, they are both for me. Because when you're in that spot, you don't get snacks. When you're in that spot, you don't get fun. And when your parents come, we're going to talk about what you did in class. Now, that is not by any means being harsh. Here's the point. And I've had people also say, well, aren't you concerned? They're missing Sunday school. I mean, they're not getting their Bible lesson. They're not getting their story for the day, their memory verse. Doesn't that bother you that they're missing that? And my answer is no, it doesn't. Because if they can learn as a child that there are consequences for the bad things, the wrong things they do, if they can learn that as a 9-year-old, how much better is that than learning it as a 16-year-old with a driver's license? And so what we are doing, we are teaching a life lesson. This is not a problem. This is an opportunity where we get to engage this kid one-on-one. We get to the core, the root of what's motivating them. We get to engage mom and dad too. And so they would come, they'd sit when mom comes and dad comes. We have a conversation about what happened. And usually at that point, there's an opening into the family. Now, there are some parents where I had one mom, and she was very bothered that her little boy, who could do no wrong, was being accused of the things that he had done. And of course, you're going to encounter that sometimes, of the parents who think that their child can do no wrong. And that's a very difficult situation, because if parents are not trying to engage kids with right behavior at home, if they're not even encouraging that, then it becomes very difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Eventually, the kid's going to learn that even though these rules don't apply at home, they still apply at church. And so in your situations, develop a process, and you've seen the one that we used. And the key points to this are, you get on their level. You've got to express how much you care about them, how much you love them. You've got to express to them that they are special. But at the same time, you do it in love, but you're consistent. You're not going to move those rules, bend those lines, because they need that consistency in their lives. Another tip that I want to give you, and it's simply this. Sometimes you may be leading a class and you have had consistent issues with a student. And sometimes what will happen is when you see that student arrive, your heart sinks. I had one leader tell me one day that she was so thankful and so glad that she was very thankful that a certain student was not in her class that day. And that is heartbreaking. And I want you to know, a lot of times those are the students who need you. They need somebody to invest their lives in them. And so if there's a student in your Sunday school class or your small group, and this student is one of those that makes you want to pull your hair out, and you are glad when they're not there, first of all, you need to begin praying for that student. And you need to begin guarding your heart. And you need to watch very carefully. In fact, I would say start engaging that student outside of your class time. Call them on the phone. Ask them what you can pray for. Develop a relationship. Go to their ball game. Look for ways that you can engage them outside of that class time. Build a relationship, because they are looking for something. And what they're looking for, ultimately what everybody's looking for, is found in Jesus Christ. But when you get these issues, You'll see them coming out of all sorts of motivations, low self-worth and issues at home and the idea that it just doesn't matter. And you have an opportunity to engage these kids with God's kind of love. Not to look at what they wear, not to look at how they behave, to look beyond all that, to look to their heart. And I also want to encourage you, when you see these kids, when they arrive, find them before they find you. Look for them intentionally and greet them. Go out of your way. Go give them a high five. And in fact, another kind of boundary that we use in our ministry a lot is a high five. And a lot of people don't realize this. We do high fives all the time, everywhere we are. The reason I started doing high fives, I was at a very large camp, and this was a long time ago, back in the 90s. And at this camp, there were a bunch of kids, and these kids, they all wanted your attention. I mean, there was over 1,000 kids there, and they all wanted your attention. And the first day, I would go out and hanging out with them, and boy, by the third day, I had claw marks, I had bruises, every one of my shirts, the necks were pulled on them, and so finally on that third day, I realized something very important, and it's the power of a high five. And the power of a high five is this: it gives a physical touch. It gives that emotional acceptance, but it also draws this nice boundary too. And especially if you have kids that want to come in and they want to hang on you, and you know that the reason they want that is because maybe they have some emotional needs that maybe aren't being met somewhere else. And so you want to give them, but you don't want to push them away. What do? Well, you draw that boundary. Find them before they find you. Give them a high five. Acknowledge them. Give them that what they're hungering for there, but in a safe way that has this boundary alongside of it. Now, today, we were not able to cover everything having to do with discipline. My goal today was simply to give you a process that had worked for us in the past and a few stories to encourage you. And I want to end with one last story. And this really doesn't deal with discipline as much as it deals with the idea that you impact students. There was a person and a lady, her name was Shirley, and she wrote an article. And in the article, she talked about an 80-year-old man that she had met. And he would never go to church. He would never go to church. And so one day she was sitting in his living room and she asked him, she said, "Why are you so resistant to going to church?" And he told her, he said, "Well, let me tell you a story. When he was a child, he went to church. One of his neighbors, they invited him. So he went to church with them. And he told her, he said he had the best time. He had a great time at church and he loved it. He said he heard stories that he had never heard before. That they ate cookies and had Kool-Aid, the snacks, they did crafts. He loved it. He couldn't wait to go back until he was leaving Sunday school. And as he was leaving Sunday school, the teacher pulled him aside, and this is what she said to him. She said, "When we come to God's house, we always want to give him our best." And she pointed at the knees of his pants. He was wearing overalls, and he had holes in the knees of his overalls. Now, she didn't know those were the best pants he had. That was all he had. But she looked at him and she said, "Now, when you come to God's house, you need to wear your best." And she said, "I don't want to see you here again with holes in your knees." And his response to her was this: "No, ma'am, I never will." And in his 80s, sitting in the living room with that lady, he said, "I told her that I never would, and I never had." He never went back. Never went back to church. And the lady who wrote the article, she said the only time she ever saw him in church was a few years later, and it was his funeral inside of his coffin. Now, I'm sharing that with you as a sad story, but to say this: we have to care about the things that are important. How a kid dresses, that's not what's important. How a kid acts, now that is important, but it's not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to invest yourself into the life of a child. It's an opportunity for you to show God's love to these kids. That one encounter with that teacher impacted that kid for the rest of his life. Imagine different encounters that you can have where you encourage kids, where you show them God's kind of love, where they experience discipline, but not discipline from the point that you're bothering me, but discipline from the point of God has special plans for your life. And I know He has plans for you. And let me share with you those plans. And part of His plan is, and we have rules, and there's safety behind those rules, not just for others, for you too. Imagine the impact you can make when you bring people into your church, and maybe they've never been to church, and they have all sorts of discipline issues, and you encounter them with the right attitude in the right way, very prayerfully, very consistently, showing God's kind of love. And that's what I want to challenge you to do, is to make the most of every opportunity to show God's love to your kids. Now, we have some resources on our website. Obviously, we didn't cover discipline as far as we went as far as time could allow. And so we have some other resources for discipline and other topics too. You can get on our website. It's 330resources.org. And when you get on there, up top, you can go to training. And under training, you'll see all sorts of topics and that you can get for children's ministry training. And I also want to encourage you to look at the resources there. The last 2 weeks, we talked about teaching God's Word in a visual way. You want to be as impacting as you can. Remember, if it's worth saying, it's worth repeating, but don't just say it. You've got to show it. And now I'm going to say this too. With discipline, that's true also. You can't just say it. You've got to show it. One last thing I want to leave you with. If you are a teacher and you find yourself red in the face, feeling frustrated, like you just can't take this anymore, inside your classroom, I want you to know, if you come to that point, you have already let the situation go way further than it ever should have. That you've got to draw the line back there, because you should never come to the point where you are feeling that way. And inside your church, you can help them develop a process so that none of your leaders get to that point. There are right ways to take care of things. And when you have the right processes in place, let me just tell you, it makes ministry easier. It also is more impacting for the kids because the consistency's there. You don't have one teacher saying one thing and another teacher saying something else. At camp, you don't have one leader giving one discipline and another leader giving another. You don't have what a lot of kids would see as favoritism. You know, how come he got that and I got this? Do you see the difference there? And so remember, consistency, get on their level, show them God's love, be clear. In fact, let your kids know the rules right up front, especially in situations where you're doing events. Let them know these are the rules right up front so they know what to expect and they know already if they're crossing the line. And you're going to have those kids. They're going to test the waters, and it's an opportunity. So make the most of that opportunity. Hope you have a great night. God bless you.